All right, good evening, everybody. We on enough? Okay. Good to have you all here. I know some of y'all know exactly what we're about to say because we did this last night, but I'm guessing there's a few new folks out there, and we were really excited to have all of you here. Wanted to mention a couple of things to you just real quick to make sure y'all know kind of what's going on. The donation boxes, we actually have two of those. We have one, they're both out here in the hall, and the suggested donation is $5 each. I want to let you know that each of our debaters has come here at no charge to themselves, at a full charge to themselves, no charge to us. Like, hey, they charge us a bunch of money, you should give them more. No, not exactly how it works. No, they have done this out of the goodness of their own hearts and their desire to see bridges built here in a place where we've had some turmoil recently. So we want to be able to give to both of them, so you can do that at our intermission during the prayer time or at the very end in the boxes in the hall right behind me. Also, we've had several people asking about live streaming. This is online if you want to text a friend or whatever, or go look for it later. woodallydebatechattanooga.com, and there is a link to the live stream on there, so you can, if anyone, you want to text them and let them know about that. So my name is Ben Graham. This is Bassam Issa. I am the pastor of Grace Baptist Church, and Bassam is president of the Islamic Society of Greater Chattanooga, as well as owning like half the town. The guy's just amazing. And I will tell you, too, because he probably is going to get mad at me for some of this, unless business really increases. I don't know. But in the whole planning of this stuff, John Brandon and I, who's really initiated a lot of this, we got to hang out with Bassam a lot and just love the guy. He's a lot of fun to hang out with. But even better, I don't know if it's even better, but it's really good. The man's restaurants are awesome. I'm just going to say. He's got really good stuff. And I said that before I knew they were his. Yeah, I'll take my tip later. The way this whole thing came about, obviously, we had a terrorist attack in July. And a lot of the news media and the coverage there was just, it seemed like a lot of people saying a lot of things about things they didn't really know about. And so that was something that John Brandon, who's sitting down here in the front and center and keeping time for us, that he noticed that. And he's been into apologetics and just looking at different debates and things and said, you know what, I want the real answer. And so he got in touch with Shabir and with David and then talked to myself and Bassam and just kind of got together to start pulling these things together. These guys jumped in right away. We were excited to bring this together too. And the whole point is not to cause any more division, but in a time when people start to make accusations and ask lots of questions, we wanted to bring some answers out. And answers from both sides in the fairest way that we could. And again, not to cause division, but quite the contrary. The goal here is to build relationships and build bridges in a time when some people turn to fear or to hatred or to anger or whatever it may be. We wanted to bring people together. And while we've got folks here with differing views, otherwise the debate really wouldn't be any fun at all, we wanted those things to come together, so we're hearing both sides. And it's fun. I think we've seen a little taste of that. I had never met Bassam before how all this happened, before this came about. And we've started a relationship as well. We're getting to enjoy one another here. And so we're hoping that even through this, that'll happen for more people. So I want to leave it to Bassam to wrap us up here.
Thank you, Ben. Peace upon you again, and Assalamu alaikum. As Ben said, this has been a planned event, and we hope you'll enjoy it like you did last night. Some of you weren't here last night, so basically fair is fair. Last night I spoke first, and tonight you did. So tonight is age before beauty.
There we go. All right.
Okay? All right. So what we want, he said enough, but what we want you to do is to open your minds, put your feelings on ice, like we did last night, the Muslims, when we were attacked. And tonight, hopefully, they don't attack you. But basically, I want you to open your eyes for the benefit. And please don't be mad at us. They represent themselves. But basically, here we, as a group, wanted to bring that to you. And if you like it, we're going to ask you at the end of the night if you like it. Inshallah, if God's willing, we will bring you others. Maybe every 6 months or every year, if you think you like it. And the other thing, if it doesn't matter, there's no winners except Chattanooga right now. Whatever happened is at Chattanoogans will be the winners, and of course we will get the credit if you're happy. This time we have to leave 5 minutes before, and you can get a taxi, will you?
I'll introduce, I don't think we've introduced here, but this is Dave Flessner. He'll be moderating our debate, so we want to turn things over to him to keep things under control.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Bassam and John, and all those that have organized this. And for those of you who were with us last night, I know many of you were, I think it was an extraordinarily thought-provoking and fascinating evening, and I'm looking forward to it again tonight as we continue to look at this question of the holy books of the Quran and the Bible. Are they books of peace, as so many have been motivated through and the proponents have said, or are they, in fact, instruments at occasion that might condone and incite violence that we've seen tragically through many centuries? To lead us in that debate again tonight, we're so honored to have two great biblical and Quranic scholars with us. David Wood, coming to us from New York. David's authored numerous books and participated in 53 of these type debates. He's a prolific writer and speaker on the subject, and he has a PhD from Fordham University and has a great expertise that he can bring to perspective from the Christian perspective. He was a former atheist that was convicted by his own study of Jesus and his resurrection and came to faith that way. And we're certainly honored to have Dr. Shabir Ally from Toronto joining us as well. He, among many other roles that he's played, he's now president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International in Toronto, Canada. He's a Muslim activist, an academic, a scholar, a public speaker on Islam and comparative religion. He's regularly appears on Canada television and like David, is a frequent participant in these types of debates. As we did last night, we'll have first introductory comments, an introductory presentation by each of the speakers of 20 minutes. Following that, we will have a break, and for our Muslim friends, there's a prayer room immediately below this facility here. For all of us, there's some refreshments out front here, if you would, and I'd remind you of the donation boxes that were mentioned earlier to help our speakers and their generosity in coming to Chattanooga. If you need the restrooms, I should tell you that they're down here on the one floor down and on to your right, to my left, at the far end, if you need to use those. And we look forward, at the end of this, we'll have some rebuttal time from each of our speakers, but you'll be given a chance to ask your own questions and answers. We would questions, and they will provide the answers. So we would encourage you to ask questions, but to wait and to sort of reserve all of that until the end of this debate, which so we can listen and learn as much as possible from one another. Tonight we take up the subject of the Bible. Is it a book of peace? And arguing in the affirmative is David Wood, who begins with our first 20-minute presentation.
Good evening. I know that this is an academic debate, but since my friend Shabir wanted to have an exchange on whether the Bible is a book of peace, you're all about to witness the power of the gospel. Any sick person or violent person can convert to some religion and commit violence in the name of that religion. And when sick or violent people adopt an ideology and decide to kill, we don't learn much about the ideology. The serial killer, Jeffrey Dahmer, was a cannibal and an atheist, but I don't think we learn much about atheism from Dahmer's cannibalism. Colleen LaRose, a.k.a. Jihad Jane, is an apparently mentally unstable convert to Islam who was arrested for plotting to kill the Swedish cartoonist Lars Vilks. I don't think we learn much about Islam from LaRose's story. Disturbed people doing disturbing things isn't very informative. But there are cases of transformation that deserve special attention. When someone goes from violent to peaceful or from peaceful to violent, we should ask, what caused the change? Over the past few years, I've read numerous stories about confused parents whose sons and daughters have gone off to join terrorist groups. And the parents say over and over again, I don't know what happened. He got along with everyone when he was young. He was so friendly. He was so nice. We don't know how he became violent so quickly. Here we should ask what caused the change. Was it the ideology or something else? But the reverse is true as well. When someone wants to kill and then suddenly becomes compassionate or merciful, we should ask what caused the change. Was it the ideology or something else? Now, the world is filled with people who are much, much nicer than I am. But I think my experience here is relevant as an introduction to some of the material I'm going to be going into when I address whether the Bible is a book of peace. So I wanted to share a little of my background. Started when I was 5 years old. I had a raggedy little mutt named Goliath who would attack anything, including bus tires. And one day my mother got a phone call telling me that Goliath had been run over by a bus, and she had to tell me. So she turned to me with tears in her eyes and informed me that my dog was dead. And I looked back, and my first thought was, so what, it's a dog. And I couldn't figure out why my mom was upset over a dog. As the years went by, people started dying, family and friends, and I always had the same reaction. So what, they're just people. People die every day. Why do you care about these ones? Years later, many years later, psychiatrists would give me a piece of paper saying that I'm a sociopath, but I didn't know any of this back then. I had violent urges as long as I can remember. Usually if someone would annoy me or upset me, I would have just an extreme desire to take them out in the woods or something and torture them. But I resisted this urge because I was told you have to resist these kind of, it's like a smoker who gets on an airplane. You have the urge to smoke, but you're not allowed to smoke, and so just keep it to yourself. And so I would keep things to myself. Occasionally I would get called to the school counselor's office. David, why did you draw a picture of you killing all your classmates? Well, it's only a picture. It's not like I'm doing anything, right? As I entered my late teens, I had already figured out that I don't have to listen to what people tell me. I don't have to listen to what society tells me. I can do whatever I want, and that I'd been duped. So I started just doing whatever I felt like doing. Sitting beside one of my friends on the couch watching TV one day, and he grabbed the remote control out of my hand, and I just turned and punched him in his face. And I didn't feel bad about it. I felt like I was finally being myself and not holding back. A while after that, I got into an argument with my best friend at the time, and I hit him with a shovel and started choking him. And I just remember smiling in his face as his eyes rolled back in his head and bloody foam came out of his mouth. It was Thanksgiving Day of 1994. I hit my dad in the head with a hammer 7 or 8 times. So I ended up in a couple of jails, a couple of mental hospitals, and a few prisons. It was 1995, and I was in a mental hospital, and it was the day of the O.J. Simpson verdict. And all the crazy people were arguing about O.J. Simpson, and some were saying he didn't do it, and so he should go free. Others were saying he did do it, so he should go to prison. And I offered a third option. I just blurted out, hey, I hope he did do it, and I hope he gets away with it. And this guard heard me, and he starts yelling at me, going, that's sick, that's sick. And couldn't figure out why this guy cared at all about some woman being murdered. A few weeks after that, I was talking to one of the administrators there at the hospital, and he was asking me about my views, and he eventually just stopped me and said, very calmly, if you don't see why that's wrong, then they have got you in the right place. This was several months later, and I was in a jail dorm making fun of a Christian named Randy, a guy who turned himself in for 21 felonies. This guy was very interesting. There'd be a fight in the dorm, and he wouldn't watch. He'd turn away and start praying for it to stop. This guy made me so mad that I started studying Christianity in order to refute what he was saying. And it was April of the following year that I became a Christian. The moment I became a Christian, ever since then, I've never had any desire to hurt anyone. But I still wasn't a very nice individual, and I considered myself after that, I considered myself a horrible individual because of the things I'd done. A few years went by, and there was a fight in the prison I was at, and I broke up the fight, and I dragged one of the guys away to keep them separated. And the next day, I was walking, and the other guy who was in the fight stopped me, and he said, Wood, I don't mean to get in your business, but some of us were wondering what you did to get in here. We're thinking maybe someone disrespected your girlfriend, and you defended her and hit him too hard, and you got locked up for that. But we can't understand how someone like you could ever end up in a place like this. And all of a sudden I was thinking, wait, you guys think I'm nice? You guys think I'm good? Just a couple years ago, people were telling me that I'm sick and that I need to stay in a mental hospital. And now you guys think that the only reason I could ever get locked up is by defending a woman's honor? Sounded strange. But some sort of change had taken place in that time period. And what's interesting is that this sort of change has been going on for the past 2,000 years in Christianity. The gospel's been having this effect for a long time. When the 12 disciples decided to follow Jesus, they thought that they were taking part in what would eventually become a violent revolution against the Roman Empire. When a group of Samaritans didn't want Jesus to come into their village, James and John said, "Should we call down fire from heaven upon them?" It's not very peaceful, but that shows you the temperament of these guys that were following Jesus. The Apostle Peter, when soldiers came to capture Jesus, Peter swung right for Malchus's head, tried to take his head off. Peter wasn't just trying to protect Jesus there. He believed he was striking the first blow in the final battle between good and evil. Not peaceful. But the apostles soon abandoned their violent intentions. In 1 Peter 2:17, the apostle Peter tells us to honor all people, not some people, all people. What happened to this guy that wanted a bloodbath? The apostle John, who initially wanted to see his enemies consumed by fire from heaven, declared in 1 John 4:8, "The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love." It's a big difference. The apostle Paul, Saul of Tarsus, was a Pharisee who believed that Judaism had to be cleansed of all heresies in order for the Messiah to come. So if you wanted violent revolution against the Roman Empire, you had to cleanse Israel spiritually, and that's why he had to exterminate Christianity. If you wanted a violent revolution against the Romans, you had to start with violence against the Christians. After becoming a Christian, Paul wrote to the church in Rome, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink." He wrote to the church in Corinth, "Let all that you do be done in love." He wrote to the church in Ephesus, "Walk in love." He wrote to the church in Thessalonica, "May the Lord cause you to increase and abound in love for one another and for all people." Not some people, all people. What happened to the guy who just wanted a bloodbath again? Now, what changed these men? I'd say two things. First, Jesus emphasized love as the core Christian virtue. One day, Jesus was asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" He said, of course, in Mark 12, "The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." But he goes on in Matthew chapter 5 to order his followers to love even their enemies. He says, "You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Not surprisingly, Jesus would rebuke his followers when they weren't walking in love. He rebuked James and John for suggesting that they should call down fire from heaven on those who opposed Jesus. When Peter attacked Malchus, Jesus said, "Put your sword back into its place, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." So he was pointing out that violence just leads to a cycle of violence. Muhammad is actually a perfect example of this. Muhammad was poisoned by a woman whose family had been killed during the invasion of Khaybar. So Jesus told his followers not to take this path. And then, by the way, he healed Malchus, a man who was part of a group that was conspiring to have him crucified. The second thing that changed the apostles was the gospel message itself. When you come to believe that God loves you so much that he entered into creation to pay for what you've done, there isn't much room for hating other people. I say from experience here, when I came to believe that God loved me in spite of what I had done, what business did I have looking down on anyone else? The Apostle Paul tried to destroy the church, Jesus' church. When God loved him and saved him anyway, how could that man ever look down on the Romans ever again? And that's why he could promote love towards everyone. If you're a Christian here today and you happen to hate someone, if you hate Muslims, I have to ask, are you out of your minds, given what we read? We can see the impact Jesus had on his followers almost immediately. On the cross, Jesus said, about the people who had him crucified and were mocking him, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." You can see the impact of this on the first Christian martyr, Stephen, when he's being stoned. And he said, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." See the impact? Didn't want them punished. A young man named Saul was there watching the stoning of Stephen. Saul would, of course, become the Apostle Paul. More than 30 years later, as Paul was awaiting his martyrdom, he wrote to his friend Timothy, "At my first defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them." And people wonder how the members of a church in Charleston can forgive the white supremacists who came in there and opened fire. Why? Where did they get that kind of forgiveness? Is it from a book of violence? One of the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament is from the early church father Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome writes about Christians who are actually selling themselves into slavery to give money to the poor. I'll go ahead and quote the passage, chapter 55, verse 2 of 1 Clement. He writes, "We know that many among ourselves had delivered themselves into bondage, that they might ransom others. Many have sold themselves into slavery, and receiving the price paid for themselves, have fed others." How did people become so loving that they would willingly sell themselves into slavery to feed the poor? You don't see that very often. For 3 centuries, Christians endured brutal persecution, and they never fought back. As the Oxford historian Robert Lane Fox writes, "During their years of persecution, Christians are not known to have attacked their pagan enemies. They shed no innocent blood except their own." But we know that violence was eventually committed in the name of Christ. So what happened? Well, in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine had a vision. He was praying about an upcoming battle, and he had a vision of a cross with the inscription, "Conquer by this." And so Constantine concluded in the 4th century that he could conquer with the cross as his symbol. And from that point on, Christianity began merging with the Roman Empire, which had both positive and negative consequences down the road. Negative because the Roman Empire had a Roman Empire kind of way of dealing with things. You crush your enemies, you don't love them. But the impact of Christianity on the Roman Empire was unmistakable, and moral reform began immediately. I'll give you a couple of examples. When Christians began preaching the gospel, the favorite form of entertainment in the Roman Empire was the gladiatorial games. And people would cheer with glee as slaves and prisoners were forced to cut each other and hack each other to pieces for people's enjoyment. The floor of the Colosseum would be just swamped in blood by the end. And one of the favorite spectacles was cutting open one of the bears to see the undigested body parts of humans that were inside it after it had eaten some human beings. And this was the main form of entertainment. Christians were horrified at this violence, and they boycotted the games. Marcus Minucius Felix records a 3rd century Roman condemnation of the Christian community as follows: "You do not attend our shows, you take no part in the processions, you are not present at our public banquets, you abhor the sacred games," the gladiator games. Within a century of Christianity becoming just a legal religion, the gladiatorial games were abolished throughout the Roman Empire. The British historian William Lecky comments, "There is scarcely any single reform so important in the moral history of mankind as the suppression of gladiatorial shows, a feat that must be almost exclusively ascribed to the Christian church." Infanticide, killing unwanted babies or leaving them exposed to die, was extremely common among the Greeks and Romans. Children born frail or with defects would be tossed in a river or left in the woods to die. Unwanted daughters would be tossed in a river or left in the woods to die. Christians condemned this practice in the 1st century. We read in the 1st century work, the Didache, "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians were collecting these abandoned children to care for them. After Christianity was legalized in 374, the Roman Emperor Valentinian, under the influence of Bishop Basil of Caesarea, outlawed infanticide and child abandonment. In the 1st century, it was standard practice for Christian churches to maintain lists of needy people who would be supported by the local church. Over the next few centuries, Christians would often care for orphans in their homes. But when Christianity was finally legalized in the 4th century, Christians invented orphanages. My father grew up in an orphanage, so he's in the debt of the Christians who invented them. In the same century, Christians invented hospitals. Prior to the spread of Christianity, there were places where soldiers could be treated, and there were places for people to go and get a diagnosis. But the idea of a place for the public where people could go in and be cared for when they were sick, that didn't occur to anyone. It occurred to Christians. So if you've ever been treated in a hospital, you're in their debt. Also in the 4th century, Christians invented hospitals for the mentally ill. I suppose I'm in their debt. As the medical historian Fielding Garrison said, the chief glory of medieval medicine was undoubtedly the organization of hospitals and sick nursing, which had its origin in the teachings of Christ. Now, we can go on, and I'm sure we'll go into more detail in the rest of this exchange, but when the impact of the gospel is so glaringly obvious, why are we having this debate? What could Shabir possibly say that would make us think that biblical commands like make every effort to live in peace with everyone, or always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people, must somehow mean kill people in the name of Christ? Well, if you want to turn the Bible into a book of violence, there are two basic routes you can go. One, you can distort the teachings of Jesus and make them sound more violent. I'll never understand why people who claim to believe in Jesus distort his teachings, but it happens from time to time. Two, you can point out that there is violence in the Bible. So Joshua fighting the Canaanites, Moses fighting various groups, Saul fighting various groups. There is violence in there. But it seems very odd to say, yes, the final message of the Bible is that Christians are to love everyone and to honor everyone. But, there's violence earlier in it, and so it's actually a message of violence. It's especially odd to see our Muslim friends complain about violence in the Old Testament, since their prophet claimed that the Torah is the word of Allah. In Sunan Abu Dawud, Muhammad told the Jews to bring him a copy of the Torah. When they brought it to him, he said, I believe in you and in the one who revealed you. So he certainly had a high opinion of these scriptures. And of course, in various places in the Quran, we have the affirmation of the inspiration, the preservation, and the authority of the Torah. So it's true that there is violence in the Torah, but the Torah is affirmed by both Christianity and Islam. The difference is that according to Christianity, this violence was limited both temporally and geographically, and it came to an end with the gospel, while in Islam the violence continues in a different form. So is the Bible a book of peace, given the final marching orders to love everyone, to honor everyone, to live in peace with everyone? I'd say that it's obviously a religion of peace and a book of peace.
Dr. Ally, your opening statement.
Hopefully tonight we don't hear that scratchiness from last night. Okay. Hello, everybody. I begin again by praising our Creator and Fashioner. I ask Him to send peace and blessings upon all of His prophets and messengers. I ask Him to bless all of you here today, bless this beautiful city of Chattanooga, and bless all of your loved ones, all of us. As we come to the final day of my public performance here in your great city, I want to remark on the fact that everyone I've met here in Chattanooga has been so nice. People at restaurants, people at stores, everyone, people at the hotel, and of course, my good friend Bassam. You're all wonderful folks, and I really enjoyed being here with you. So, to the business at hand, tonight, is the Bible a book of peace? In order to answer that question, I want to go back to the
criteria that I established last night to show the connectivity between what we're discussing last night and what we're discussing tonight. So we don't deal with each book in isolation, but we want to have common principles based on which we can evaluate both books. Otherwise, as I said last night, it's anyone's call. We don't like a certain thing, so we say we don't like it, and then we invent our own reasons why we don't like that thing. And the thing we like, we invent different reasons for why we like that thing. But can we come to common ground and have common criteria for the two books? This is what I tried to establish yesterday. And you will recall that when I dealt with that topic, I said, is the Quran a book of peace? And I answered that by saying, I'm going to use 4 criteria. And the first criteria I said was, how does the book present its heroes? And I showed that the Quran presents its heroes as peaceful individuals. Even the biblical heroes, according to David, as you know, he said that Joshua and David are known for violence in the Old Testament. Well, a lot of violence, tremendous violence, genocide included in the case of Joshua. But when they are represented in the Quran, they're represented as peaceful individuals, or those who are shown to be associated with some violence. The total violence that is known from the Old Testament is not repeated in the Quran. So on the whole, the violence is either toned down or eliminated altogether in the Quranic presentation of these heroes. And that's very important, I believe, as a criterion. The second criterion I said is, does the book command people to live in peace? And I've said that there's a verse in the Quran that does that. David disputed that, but that's not our question tonight. Our question is, if this is a criterion that I used in looking at the Quran, how will that criterion be applied to the Bible, and how would the Bible fare in the face of that criterion? The third criterion, I said, is that the book should put together a legal system that would allow people to live in peace. We know that you cannot have peace without justice. So do you have a legal system in the book that allows people to know their rights and responsibilities so that everything is fair and square between individuals, so that people live in peace with justice? And the third is the just war theory that allows for, in the case that war becomes necessary, how do you fight a war? First of all, what are the stipulations before going into a war to be sure that this is a just war to get into? Second, when you're in the war, how do you conduct yourselves in a just manner? And third, at the end of the war, how do you repatriate and make things right, making sure that there's not going to be another war popping up suddenly, and that you have achieved the goal for which you set out fighting a war in the first place, because you don't go into a war without proper goals, and now you want to make sure that it's all done. So that's just war theory. And I said last night that in my estimation, there's nothing in the Quran that actually goes outside of these parameters of just war theory. And my challenge to David was to find something in the Quran and show that this goes outside of just war theory. And he did mention something, but I don't want to relive that at the moment. If he wants to bring that up again, we'll deal with it, or if we have time, we'll deal with that as a separate issue. But our main topic tonight is what we come to now. Applying these principles, how do we evaluate the Bible? Now, to elaborate on my just war theory, I drew on a book by Professor Darrell Cole from Drury University. His book is entitled, as you can see, why is it that my presentation is not up? Hold on. It should be HDMI, which is there, and laptop, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what? Because I didn't start it, actually. I just here. Okay. So to go back over very briefly, I started out with this slide, and then I moved on. I said, okay, these are my points, but you've heard me, and there's nothing more to it than what you've heard. But I want to show you this book. And this is where we are. So Professor Darrell Cole has written this book. He's a professor at Drury University. He's a committed Christian, and he has given us the just war principles that comes out of the thinking of some great Christian philosophers and saints, starting with St. Ambrose. Then we went to St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who said these are the 3 A's, if you remember. And then he went to also John Calvin, so he said that's the C, so we have 3 A's and a C for a good report card. But then it didn't end there. The thinking about just war theory continued in the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages into modern times, and the update on that is given by Professor Andrew Wilson in his course book that is entitled "The Masters of War History's Greatest strategic thinkers. And so with this idea of just war theory, then, we want to see how does the Bible measure up to that. If there is a war, how is the war conducted? So that brings us to the question of tonight. After having concluded myself that the Quran is a book of peace, I want to ask the same question about the Bible. Is the Bible a book of peace? So to evaluate that question, rather than put my own bias into the question, let's go and use the same criteria, which I think to be fair criteria. Since I've applied that to the Quran, let's do that in the case of the Bible now. So the first criterion I want to look at, how does the Bible present its heroes? David has given us a rosy picture of the Bible talking about love, and that's true. And of course, Christians are loving people. And in fact, do you know that the Quran itself acknowledges that Christians are people characterized by love? In the 57th chapter of the Quran says, وَجَعَلْنَا فِي قُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُ رَأْفَةً وَرَحْمَةً. And we have placed in the hearts of those who follow Jesus mercy and compassion. Ra'fa could be love and mercy, and also compassion, the next word that is there in Arabic. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bassam, or those of you who know Arabic here. So the Quran is acknowledging that Christians are great people. They are loving individuals. They're characterized by kindness and all of that. So all of the history that David has charted from the first century going to the later centuries of Christians setting up hospitals and so on, feeding people, taking care of the orphans, all of this is acknowledged. There's no dispute there. Now, how does the book itself measure up? Because it is possible that Christians are good people not because of the book itself, or maybe because of some parts of the book. Maybe they follow some parts of the book and ignore some other parts. We know in logic that there is the fallacy, that fallacies related to causation. So people, instead of identifying the whole host of causes, they identify just simply one cause. So we need to find out the whole host of causes, like what caused Christian people to be as they are. So one cause is, yes, they have read passages in the Bible. For example, God is love, 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. Now, when we ask, is that the only teaching in the Bible? The answer may be different. What about the heroes? How are the heroes presented? Now, it's often said that, these people we're talking about, Joshua and David and so on, they're all from the Old Testament, right? So what about the New Testament? The New Testament supposedly presents a new picture. However, in the book of Hebrews, a number of persons are given as the great heroes who were so great that the world is not fit to bear them. And among these persons are David and others who, according to the book of Hebrews, what characterizes them as being great? They were conquerors. They were conquerors. And I thought David had a problem with Muhammad being a conqueror. And whether Muhammad was or not, that's a separate question. But if David has a problem with Muhammad being a conqueror, then how does this New Testament praise some people who were conquerors? So we have to get the whole list, and we can go to Hebrews chapter 11 and see that whole list before us. So we want to go to Hebrews. I'm in Hebrews chapter 1, going forward to chapter 11. It's most embarrassing when you're looking for something and you can't find it, and you thought it's there. So in Hebrews chapter 11, starting with verse number 12, what more shall I say? I have not time to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by their faith conquered kingdoms. And so on, until he goes to say that the earth was not fit to carry these persons. So I don't know that much about Gideon. And I don't know anything about Barak, except that there's a Barak in the White House. But what about Samson? I remarked last night that Samson killed himself and a whole host of people in the arena. Now, you might say these were bad people, but do Christians kill bad people? Does the New Testament teach us to kill bad people? Well, it seems that in this part, the New Testament is celebrating the life and glory of a person who is known to be a mass killer. And I say this with hesitation. I mean, David is right. Muslims have to respect the Bible. And it is true that the Quran says that the Torah has in it revelation from God. And Muslims believe that. We're not denying that. Now, for the Muslim, the trouble is that there would be revelation also in these ancient books, but also those revelations are mixed with other things that people have put in there. So the Muslim needs to distinguish between the two. Another verse of the Quran, which David didn't mention, is the second chapter of the Quran, the 79th verse, which says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ لِيَشْتَرُوا بِهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say it is from God in order to profit thereby but a little. So from this passage, Muslims generally understand that previous scriptures were corrupted by human individuals. And you might be saying, okay, the Quran is saying that's a Muslim book. We don't have to worry about a Muslim book. But in fact, the Bible also shows that the Torah has been corrupted. Where? In Jeremiah chapter 8, verse number 8. Jeremiah, the prophet, is saying, how can you say we are wise and we have the Torah of the Lord, whereas the lying pens of the scribes have falsified it? Now, the translations in various books may be different, but that's the basic idea. Jeremiah is saying that the Torah, as they have them at that time, has been corrupted by the pens of the scribes. So now, for a Muslim, when we read the stories about David and so on, we're saying David was a great prophet of God. The Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. How could Muslims accept that a man like this committed some of the atrocities that are mentioned of him in the Old Testament? So we don't think he did. One of the things that's mentioned about David is that he wanted to marry Michal, Saul's daughter, and Saul basically said to him, well, you want to marry Michal? Great, but you have to bring me 200 Philistine foreskins. Now, so the Israelites and the Philistines are always at loggerheads with each other, and Samson was usually going out and killing some Philistines and coming back. He's the hero of the Israelites. Now, David is the hero of the Israelites, so to get married, he has to bring 200 Philistine foreskins. Now, how do you get 200 Philistine foreskins? You have to scalp the men, right? Scalp. Obviously, we'd have to kill them first and then scalp them in the right place and then bring back the proof that he has killed them. Then he gets the girl. None of this is mentioned in the Quran. What about Jephthah? Jephthah actually killed his daughter after having vowed to do so. And then God apparently fulfilled what he wanted, and so he had to carry out the vow. And it is interesting that the Quran actually prevents people from killing their infants. David was citing a Christian scholar who said that, killing infants is wrong. So it would be nice to have a verse of the Bible which says killing infants is wrong. And there is actually a verse as well about sacrificing your children to the gods. But the Quran itself prohibits people from killing their infants, because at the time when the Quran was revealed, girls were being buried alive. We learn from some of the early sources. So we go on to David. I mentioned David. That Samuel was receiving revelations from God. And his revelations were telling Saul that he had to go out and kill some more, because Saul was basically commanded to kill off the Amalekites. And he didn't kill them all off. So he spared some, and some animals. And Samuel's message to Saul was, God spoke to me and told me, man, you've got to go out and kill some more. You've got to kill them all off. So why kill them all off? Where does this idea come from? In the Old Testament, there's this idea of harem, which is related to the Arabic word haram. So there's a total ban put on a town, but it's not only on one town. There are many places. God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, and within that land that God is giving them, everything that breathes has to be eliminated. So several people are named: the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Amorites. I can't even remember all of the names. The Canaanites and the Amalekites. So Saul's problem was that he took pity on some of them. He didn't kill them all. Now, in Deuteronomy, one of the books of the Torah, details what's to be done. You get into this. If you're dealing with a place that God has given you as your possession, the Israelites are given possession of that place, then they kill everything that breathes. But if they go to another place where outside of the range of which God has given them to possess, that means apart from what God has given them, they may have other conquering ambitions. If they go to this other place, then they should offer terms of peace. And if the people surrender under terms of peace, there is a way of dealing with them. but in the land in which God has given you, you kill everything that breathes. And so Saul did not fulfill the commandment, and that was the problem there. So the New Testament is approving of these great heroes. So that's my question. How does the book present its heroes? That's my first criterion. The second criterion is there a command in the Bible that says you should live in peace? And I'm sure there is. I haven't studied it in that great detail, and I'm sure that David will have verses lined up that deal with that. There are many parts of the Bible that actually are very peaceful, and when we acknowledge that. So I'm going to move on from that criteria, and I will say put a star there. The Bible, it has flying colors right there. 3, what about a legal system? About a legal system to let people live in peace. Now, we've already seen that the Old Testament actually does not have a universal legal system that will allow everybody to live in peace. In fact, sometimes people, like David will say, oh, but now we have the New Testament, everybody can love each other, and so on. What about the people in Palestine? The people in Palestine live in part of the land which the Israelites think has been given to them. They have the title deed. But the title deed, a book from God. So this book says that they own all of that land, and the Palestinians do not have a right to live there. So Jews are coming in from other parts of the world, flocking into Jerusalem because they think that they should be there, and the Palestinians are being shoved off of the more lucrative parts of the land. So even international decrees are defied by those who think we don't have to follow the international decrees. We can go set up our residence on the Palestinian land because it's not really Palestinian land. This land is our land. God told us. So these commandments in the Bible actually do have repercussions for peace in our present times. It is not a complete system of justice that will allow people to live in peace. Now, does the New Testament change that? No, actually no, because the New Testament reaffirms the right of the Israelites. The New Testament basically says, well, Christians are the new Israel, but there is ambiguity in the New Testament with Paul, for example, saying that God's promise is irrevocable. So he gave a promise to the Israelites. That promise is irrevocable. So the Israelites do own that land according to the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. Today, there is a proposal that perhaps there can be a peaceful settlement between Palestinians and Israelites. Let's have a two-state solution and divide Jerusalem. We take East Jerusalem, you take West Jerusalem. Some say no. Why? Because God gave them Jerusalem. And the New Testament affirms that Jerusalem has that status, even all the way down to the book of Revelation, which I like David's statement, the marching orders. How does the book end? The book ends with Revelation reaffirming all of these things. Now, the just war theory. Does the book give you a just war theory? And in fact, no, we cannot approve of genocide. No just war theory is going to approve of genocide and ethnic cleansing. And yet we see that being done in the Bible again and again, over and over. Finally, I want to say something about the book of Revelation, because it's all this about, God is love and so on. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. It sounds nice. But then the book of Revelation shows that when Jesus comes back, he will actually kill off the people who were his enemies. So he will persecute his enemies rather than pray for them. Moreover, there are indications in the book of Revelation that his faithful followers will be caught up into heaven with him in the great rapture, and then they will come back with him to fight in his great army. To do what? To decimate the population. And it is interesting that in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 63, God is shown with his clothes bloodied after he has stepped over the dead bodies of his enemies. And now Jesus in the book of Revelation is shown like father, like son. He comes back with a sword coming out of his mouth. He kills his enemies. His garment is also red with the blood of his enemies. And when we debated a week or so ago in Detroit, David quoted for me a passage from the Psalm, Psalm 110, showing that God is saying to Jesus, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. What does that mean? It means that Jesus is going to be sitting on a throne, and what is his foot going to rest on? The slain bodies of his enemies. And there is the undercurrent in the New Testament thinking that Jesus should be that victorious conqueror. So we have both. It is both a book of love and also a book of war and dreadful violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabir. Thank you, David. We'll take a 15-minute break now, and if we can, we'll try to reconvene at 7:45. 7:35. Let's make it 7:35. Excuse me, quickly at the back. 7:30.
Hey, Dave, I think we should wait for Sam just to make sure we've got our guys out of prayer and all. She said it had been in here. I'm just making sure we're not missing the guys from prayer. He doesn't have to be here to start, but I figure he'd like to be.
Downstairs to check if anyone's still there. So he'll be up.
Okay. We're going to hang out with him.
No, I think I did. Perfect. Yeah. Oh, it was only out for about, I would say, 30 seconds. It's up to you, right?
I think this is going to be open. One of these gentlemen who's been you walked in with? Okay, they just walked in with you. They're just following you. Better watch out. Man, we got some moving an eye on you here. Okay. So if you see somebody you want to sit next to you, calm down. Well, it's a good little trip there. I'll go out and holler real quick and make sure.
Well, thanks for coming back together again, and we will now begin with 2 rounds of rebuttals as we had last night. We'll have a 12-minute rebuttal from each of our speakers and an 8-minute rebuttal and a concluding statements, and then we'll have some time for questions from you at the end. So keep those questions, and we'll be glad to entertain those at the end. At this point, for the first rebuttal, David Wood.
Thank you. In my opening statement, I drew attention to the impact the Bible had on the early Christians and on the generations that followed. Before their transformation, Jesus' apostles wanted violent revolution. After their transformation, they wanted revolutionary love. Some of the early Christians took this revolution to such an extreme that they started selling themselves into slavery in order to feed the poor. Within a century of becoming a legal religion, Christians had outlawed infanticide and the gladiatorial games, and they had invented orphanages, hospitals, and mental hospitals. And that's the impact of the gospel, and Shabir didn't dispute most of this. But according to Shabir, the Bible is not a book of peace. He says we need criteria for judging a book of peace. And I agree that we need criteria. I happen to reject most of his criteria as something that would decide whether a book is a book of peace. My criteria are much simpler. If the final marching orders of the book are to love everyone, to live in peace with everyone, I would say it's a book of peace. If the final marching orders of the book are violently subjugate unbelievers, I would say it's not a book of peace. But Shabir has other criteria. He says, how does a book present its heroes and role models? As I pointed out last night, Muhammad is presented as a role model who called for fighting unbelievers simply for being unbelievers, for only showing mercy towards one's fellow Muslims and never towards unbelievers, and so on. But if we're talking about biblical figures, Shabir has a couple of complaints that I wouldn't take very seriously and some that I would, and so I'm going to focus on those. But as far as the ones that I wouldn't take very seriously, Samson, when he's captured, he's a prisoner of war, and the people gather together to mock him and to mock Israel's God, and this is in the context of war, and he pushes down the pillars, and it brings down the people who are gathered together in the context of war. I wouldn't say that that would make the Bible a book of peace. David, during a context of war, being sent out to kill Philistines and bring back proof of how many he had killed. This is a context of war. Jephthah killing his daughter, I wouldn't consider this much of anything. The judges in the book of Judges are not great moral figures, and they're not presented as such. I mean, Samson's running around with a prostitute. Jephthah makes a hasty vow and then keeps the vow. Nothing involving God as affirming what he did. Now, Shabir says that I condemn Muhammad for conquering, and so why don't I condemn these other people for conquering? Well, I don't condemn Muhammad for conquering. I would have a lot to say about him fighting unbelievers simply for being unbelievers, fighting and subjugating Jews and Christians for being Jews and Christians. I have a lot to say about that. But even there, just to clarify in case anyone is confused, my objection to Islam is not that it promotes violence towards unbelievers. My objection to Islam is that it's not true. I say that it promotes violence towards unbelievers because people keep saying that it doesn't, and the media keeps saying that it doesn't, and politicians keep saying that it doesn't. If we could get past that and look at what Islam actually teaches, we could then ask the question whether it's true or not. Now, so the issues that would be more important would be what Shabir has called genocide. And yesterday he said, I called it genocide. I don't call it genocide. And there's actually a problem here. There's actually a problem here with Shabir's interpretation of these texts. Now, Shabir says that these passages in the Old Testament are calling for genocide. And I will grant that if you read the passage without the surrounding text, that you might come to that conclusion because that's what it sounds like it's calling for. It sounds like it's saying completely wipe everyone out, completely destroy everyone. That's what the text sounds like it's saying. If you read the rest of the text, you will see it can't possibly mean that. I don't mean I'm interpreting it differently. I mean it can't possibly mean what Shabir says it means. So these texts that call, he pointed to texts in Deuteronomy, for instance, which call for completely wiping people out. Side by side with these texts, in fact, far more common are commands to drive them out and claims that God will drive them out before you. Now, how are these two reconcilable? One, think of the two commands. One, go and wipe everyone out. Leave alive nothing that breathes. And in the same text you would find, drive them out before you. What's going on there? We would look at those as complete contradictions, not in the ancient Near East. So let me give you an example. In Exodus 23:23, God says to the Israelites, my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. So they're going to be completely destroyed, right? They're destroyed and there's going to be nothing left, according to that text. Later, in the same chapter, God explains what he means. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. I will drive them out before you little by little until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. So what's going on here? God says he's going to drive them out little by little, and yet he says he's going to destroy them. Those sound like completely different things to us. Not in the ancient Near East. I'll give you another example of the problem here. All the groups that are said to be destroyed appear later on in the text. If they're destroyed, if they're wiped out, if nothing has been left alive, how do these groups all appear later in the text? So for instance, we have the commands to go and slaughter everyone in the book of Deuteronomy and Exodus and so on, side by side with passages saying that God's going to drive them out. Then in the book of Joshua, Joshua goes city by city, and it says that he completely does what the Lord says. He completely wipes them out, nothing left alive. And then we have everything summed up for us in Joshua 11:23. So Joshua took the entire land just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions, and the land had rest from war. So everything's done. Joshua had done what God commanded him. That would mean wipe everything out, if that's what the text means, right? Why do we read in the very next book, first verse, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites? I thought Joshua had already wiped out the Canaanites in accordance with everything the Lord commanded him. And then the first verse, right after his death, who's going to fight the Canaanites for us? This should be telling you something is going on. They're using language in a way that we don't. If drive people out of the land is used side by side with utterly destroy them, that should be the first clue. And when the groups that are said to be killed and destroyed are around later in the text, that should be the second clue. And we find the same thing with the issue of the Amalekites. So here's a passage. Saul is ordered, 1 Samuel 15:3, now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has and do not spare him, but put to death both men and women, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So kill everything, right? And then it says, Saul did it, except he kept the king alive. So everyone is dead. All the Amalekites are dead except the king. And then Samuel kills the king. So now there are no more Amalekites, if that's what the text means. Later in the same book, 1 Samuel 27:8-9. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. How are the Amalekites there? They were supposedly completely exterminated. The Amalekites show up again in 1 Samuel 30. Centuries later, they're still there during the reign of Hezekiah in 1 Chronicles 4. Still more centuries later, the main enemy of the Jews in the book of Esther is Haman, a descendant of King Agag, the king who was supposedly the last living Amalekite. What's going on with the text? Well, we happen to know exactly what's going on with the text because we can compare it with other ancient Near Eastern sources. And when we do that, we find that this is a literary device. If you conquered someone else's army, you use bragging rights of complete annihilation of them. This was meant to intimidate. This was meant to boast and brag about your God and so on. And it's a common literary device. We do something slightly similar. If your football team wins, you don't say, we scored way more points than them. You say, we massacred them, we slaughtered them, we butchered them, and you didn't do any of that literally. That's how we talk. They just took it to another level. And notice, it has to be that, unless you think the authors are completely insane, and that they don't realize, hey, once I've said in my text that this group has been completely exterminated, I obviously can't have them showing up later in the text. So they're either insane or they're using a literary device, but we know it's a literary device. Zaini Zevit, professor of biblical literature at Northwestern Semitic languages, says when the composition and rhetoric of the Joshua narratives in chapters 9 through 12 are compared to the conventions of writing and conquest in Egyptian, Hittite, Akkadian, Moabite, and Aramaic texts, they're revealed to be very similar. And we find this from many others. We know what's going on here. It's called hagiographic hyperbole. You don't say, I beat them. You say, I completely slaughtered them and left nothing left alive. So, there is violence, there is an invasion, there is fighting, but it's not the genocide that Shabir calls for. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there later in the text. Shabir's second criterion. Does the book command people to live in peace? He said it probably does. I'll go ahead and make it certain for him. Since he quoted the book of Hebrews, talking about the heroes it puts forward and saying this puts forward heroes of violence, I'll quote Hebrews 12:14, says that Christians are to pursue peace with all men. Again, not some men, all men. Third, does the book give a legal system to govern life? Well, Christianity isn't about establishing a legal system. Jesus said his kingdom is not a kingdom of this world. He said if it were, his followers would be fighting to rescue him, but his kingdom is not of this world. As a general rule, if you take to heart, love your neighbor as yourself, that's going to work in a variety of contexts, regardless of the form of government. Now, Shabir complains about the Bible because he says that Jews claim that the Bible gives them the right to the land. And so since the Bible claims that Jews have right to the land, well, this is never going to allow peace. Let me read a verse of the Quran here, chapter 5, verse 32. Allah says, "For this reason did we prescribe to the children of Israel that whoever slays a soul, unless it be for manslaughter or for mischief in the land, it is as though he slew all men." This says he revealed to the children of Israel, if anyone makes mischief in the land, what land would that be? Is it A, China, B, Chattanooga, or C, Israel? The Quran says God gave them the authority to carry out Jewish law in the land of Israel. So if he has a problem with that in the Bible, well, he just once again condemned his own text. And finally, Shabir says, if war becomes necessary, are the book's teachings consistent with just war theory? Now, it's simply amazing that Shabir is appealing to just war theory as developed by Christians in order to condemn the book that led to just war theory. There were some earlier writers, such as Cicero and so on, who gave some principles of just war theory, but the full-fledged just war theory comes because Christians were in the Roman Empire, and again, the Roman Empire still had a Roman way of doing things, and Christians wanted to make sure that they could reconcile the passage in Romans 13, which says that governments are instituted to punish wrongdoers, but to keep those consistent with Christian principles of loving your neighbor as yourself and loving your enemies. And so these were harmonized in just war theory that, yes, there are times when war is necessary for the state, but that you need to do everything you can to keep it in line with these principles. And Shabir appeals to this to then condemn the book that gave rise to it. So he's kind of indirectly there admitting that it's the Bible that produced this, and therefore the Bible is a book of peace.
Shabir, your first rebuttal.
You guys hear me? All right. So that was very interesting, David. I'm glad that you finally engaged with the criteria that I presented. So I want to see what David has to say about these criteria. First, about the heroes. David is saying, well, we won't take Samson seriously because he was operating within a context of war. He was a prisoner of war. Yet, when I went to Sunday school and we colored drawings of Samson, we came away thinking this is the great hero with that, here, if it gets cut off by Delilah, then he's rendered powerless. So, want to be a hero like Samson. The question is, how does the book present its heroes? David, I took an interest in slingshots when I knew the story of David, but the story didn't end with the slingshot. The slingshot in the Bible only knocked Goliath out. The rest of the story is that David went and cut off his head. So the violence goes on and on. But in the Quran, we just have a simple statement. وَقَتَلَ دَاوُدُ جَالُوتَ. David killed Goliath. That's the end of the story. It doesn't say anything more. None of that bloody detail. Jephthah. Okay, I'll give up Jephthah. I'm even sorry that I even mentioned it. But I just mentioned it because it came in the sequence here. Because that doesn't have violence. It doesn't have repercussions for violence in society, unless you're thinking that maybe somebody is dealing with a child, thinking the child is possessed by the devil, and it can have repercussions. But I'm gonna leave that one alone. Forget about Jephthah. So David, you scored a point. Now, he's saying that he does not condemn the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for conquering. But let's think about what he's actually condemning the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for, and how that compares with these heroes of the Bible. David says that the final marching orders in the Quran, which Muhammad is giving, or which Muhammad is revealed or receiving by revelation according to Muslims, that these enjoin violence against non-Muslims because they are non-Muslims. And as I pointed out yesterday, Sherman Jackson in his article, Jihad in the Modern World, has explained with reference to Fred Donner that in that context, in 7th century Arabia, it's different from now. Like nowadays, you sit safely thinking that nobody's going to attack your country. Why? First of all, because America is a great and powerful nation. You don't expect that somebody's going to attack you. But second, countries don't generally attack each other nowadays because they all are subscribing to certain international conventions that says we're not going to attack each other, so we can all sleep in peace at night. But in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as Fred Donner has pointed out, the general idea was that people are at a state of war unless they have entered into a specific covenant. And with that idea in mind, the question is then, who did the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, enter into covenants with? And as long as people have entered into covenants with him, he would not attack him, and he does not expect them to attack he would not attack them, and he would not expect them to attack him. So it is in that context that when we look at the Quran, we see, for example, what David is citing as final marching orders comes in the 9th chapter of the Quran. The 29th verse, he has cited to show that Muslims are somehow going to fight against Jews and Christians in general, but that's not what the verse says, literally. If you take the verse literally, the verse is saying that you should fight against those from among the people of the book, who could be Jews, Christians, and others as well, those from among the people of the book who do not believe in God. Now, we have some Christians in this room here. We have some Christians in this room. Okay, if you don't believe in God and you're a Christian, just raise your hand. Okay, that means there's nobody in this room to whom that verse applies. Because that verse is saying, fight against those people of the book who do not believe in God, and do not, and so on. So there are a number of criteria. So for somebody to meet all of those criteria and to follow the verse literally, it just would not apply. Now, David might say, well, okay, in that case, the verse is meaningless. And then I can say, well, if the verse is meaningless, you can't say that this verse is commanding you to do something if you don't know what the verse is commanding you to do. So now let's say ISIS is trying to recruit a young Muslim and saying, come join our forces and let's go kill some people. And the young man says, okay, well, who said we should kill these people? And ISIS says, God says. So the young man says, well, show me the verse where it says God says. And then the verse doesn't actually say that. So the ISIS may say, well, that's our interpretation. Well, okay, say it's your interpretation. So the same book might be interpreted by somebody peacefully and somebody else violently, but is your violent interpretation coming right out of the book, or are you putting it into the book? In this case, it's clear that they're putting it into the book, and David is going along with those Muslim scholars who have actually read it that way. They did read it in a violent way. And so David is right in that sense, in that he is relying on some Muslim scholars. But as we've seen last night, David has his own agenda. He's not relying on the Muslim scholars like a Muslim relies on the Muslim scholar. The Muslim is relying on a Muslim scholar because the average Muslim doesn't know better, doesn't know the Arabic, doesn't know the history, doesn't know how Quranic interpretation has been done. And the average Muslim is going to follow those sacred books which they know from ancient history. In fact, I'm sorry, I said sacred because they're not sacred books. The commentaries by Muslim scholars are not sacred. They could be right, they could be wrong, and we know that as a matter of principle. But the average Muslim might even treat them as sacred. Yeah, these are great scholars. Yeah, how can you say anything critical of them? They must be right. And who are you with a newfangled doctrine? Maybe you because you live in Canada, maybe because you were educated in a modern Western secular university. That's why you have these ideas. But I say go back to the text. Well, we all know Arabic. The modern standard Arabic is basically similar to the Quranic Arabic. The Arabic has remained standard throughout the ages, fairly so, even though all languages evolve, so too does Arabic. And we can go back to the classical commentaries and see how did they reach that interpretation. Now, if you do this for yourself, go to an English translation of that verse, chapter 9, verse number 29, and you will see that they all have to put something in brackets to make it mean what they want it to mean. So Muslims should fight against Jews and Christians, all Jews and Christians. How do they do that? By putting things in brackets. But the verse itself says only those Jews and Christians who do not believe in God and do not believe in the life hereafter, which the Quran calls the last day, and so on. So to find maybe nowadays you might find some Christians who, they say they're Christians, but they don't actually believe in God. I know that. But if you think of 7th century Arabia, people were not affected by modern theories about the existence of God and so on, or the non-existence of God. So then, what we find is that David is actually distorting the Muslim scripture, and he's not the first to do it. Muslim scholars have done it before, for good reasons and with good intentions, and the violent extremists today are banking on that misinterpretation, and David is celebrating that misinterpretation because, as he admitted here last night, he is happy when, like ISIS, commits atrocities against people because that helps his evangelizing mission. Actually, he said that. Didn't he say this? David actually said this. David actually said this. I'll read you. I actually transcribed in my own hand what he said. I didn't think it would become necessary, but I was just interested. If you go to the recording of what David said last night, at exactly 1 hour, 31 seconds, and 1 hour, 38 minutes, and 38 seconds, this is what David said. He said, and he's referring to me. So Shabir said, I'm inserting Shabir. Shabir said that I actually like ISIS killing people because I can use that to win converts. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. I love it when ISIS goes around raping their captives and chopping people's heads off and crucifying them and blowing their brains out, because I think that will really help me in my ministry work. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. So continue then. To continue then, this is a distortion. Now, he says he wouldn't call these acts of violence genocide. Why wouldn't he call them genocide? It's wiping out the whole people. Now, he says because this is a literary device, it didn't really mean genocide. It's just talking about wiping them out like we say we wiped out somebody in a hockey game. The only thing is at the end of the hockey game, there's only a little bit of blood from somebody's lips being hit. But what we find is that actual numbers of people and very graphic descriptions. When we sing round and round the walls of Jericho, but the rest of the story is that it says actually that Joshua went in there and killed everything that breathed. So maybe there's an exaggeration, but it is still the basic idea is that there's a vast amount of killing going on here. And what he has cited actually is the fact that the Bible does contradict itself. There are various writers. So somebody wrote the book of Joshua, somebody else wrote Judges, and they have different ideas. So even though in the book of Joshua it's saying that everybody has been killed off, these people pop up again by a different writer because a different writer has a different idea. I said last night that I don't blame Joshua for this. I don't think Joshua is being properly represented in these books. These are not historical. I agree with that study. That shows that these are not really historical. Yes, there is evidence that people survived. But this, what he's calling a literary device, is pointing to the fact that the text literally says that Joshua wiped out these people. So it is genocide. City by city, one after another. What about 1 Samuel chapter 15? Yes, so when you come down, everybody killed off except the one king, and then Samuel comes and kills the king. So it is like very specific. People are being killed. It's not just a literary device. What about the legal system? Well, if we see what is the system, in Deuteronomy chapter number 20, there are instructions specific. What do you do with the cities that you attack? You lay siege to them. If they agree to be subjected to you, you force them into labor. If they refuse, you do battle with them. You lay siege to them. And then when God delivers them into your power, you put every male to the sword. And then the women and the children you keep for yourselves. And then what about the cities in the area which God has given you? Then you kill everything that breathes. This is very specific. It's not just a literary device. It's not that I am misrepresenting or misunderstanding the Bible. Scholars of Christianity struggle with the same thing. Show Them No Mercy is a book co-authored by some Christian evangelical scholars. They're admitting as a fact that this genocide took place. They're now asking, what do we do with that? How do we understand it in reference to the New Testament? So they're not disputing the fact. Now, finally, Laying Down the Sword by Philip Jenkins. On page number 13, this is what he has to say. If the founding text shapes the whole religion, then Judaism and Christianity deserve the utmost condemnation as religions of savagery. Of course, they are no such thing, nor is Islam. I respect Judaism, I respect Christianity, I respect the Bible. I didn't say that the Bible is not a book of peace. David misquoted me when he said that. I said to you, and you heard me, that it is peaceful and also violent. Take it the way you like. Thank you.
David, your second rebuttal.
Thank you, Shabir. Now, Shabir went back to his first criterion, how does a book present its heroes and role models? He said in Sunday school, Samson and David are presented as heroes. According to the Bible, Samson's a dirtbag, right? I mean, let's face it, this guy's going around, messing around. This guy's doing everything he's not supposed to do as a follower of God. The point of these stories, because Muslims don't exactly have the same thing in Islam, the point of the stories about God taking horrible sinners and doing something with them is a consistent theme throughout Scripture. It's Jesus who is the one who is perfect. And Muslims have this idea that prophets are sinless or something like this. It doesn't come from the Quran. That doesn't come from the Quran itself. That's a Muslim myth that developed over time. But so Samson is you would lift him up for doing something in spite of his massive failures. David is actually described as a man after God's own heart. But the things David did that were wrong, like the affair with Bathsheba and so on, he's condemned for that and judged for it and suffers for the rest of his life for it. So it's not saying be like David in every way. David is portrayed as a sinner who is nevertheless used by God in a mighty way. Now, Shabir asks, well, what do I condemn Muhammad for if I'm not condemning him for conquering? He says that Fred Donner says that in that context you were at war unless there was some sort of agreement. You're just at war with everyone. Let's look at the text Shabir quotes, because Shabir quoted Surah 9:29, and apparently this is talking about atheist Christians and Jews, those who don't actually believe in God. Let's read the verse. Fight those, chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger. So if you don't forbid the same things that Muslims forbid, if you eat pork and Islam forbids pork, you don't forbid the same things, therefore this applies to you. Nor acknowledge the religion of truth. What's the religion of truth? Islam, right? According to this text. You Christians, you acknowledge Islam as the religion of truth? Well, what's it say? Fight those who, and then it gives this list of criteria for fighting you. Nor acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book, Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, if Shabir's interpretation is correct, Muhammad sure didn't know it, because Muhammad launched an offensive attack against the Roman Christians, and I'm pretty sure they believed in God. Now, it's ironic that Shabir condemns me for distorting the meaning of the text, even though he acknowledges there are many Muslim scholars who would agree with me. But given the distortion of my sarcasm here, Shabir, if you've never encountered sarcasm, it's a lovely Western concept. Now, Shabir says that, well, why wouldn't I call it genocide? Joshua took Jericho. Jericho's another perfect example, right? So we read the story of Joshua taking Jericho, right? Remember I talked about hagiographic hyperbole. If you conquered and defeated your enemy, you got these massive boasting rights as a mean of taunting others and so on. And this was, again, a standard literary device of the time. It wasn't considered deceptive. People of that time would have understand exactly what you're doing. The Egyptians did it. The Hittites did it. The Moabites did it. Israel would have been odd if they didn't do it. And so this is what we find in Scripture. But the Joshua taking Jericho is a perfect example, because what we know from archaeology is that Jericho was not a civilian town. It was a military outpost. It might have had some sort of inn or something like that, but it was a military outpost. There was no civilian population at Jericho. And so what do you have about Joshua going in and killing and wiping everyone out? Well, the same thing you have with the other stories of Joshua going and fighting places. What would have actually happened is Joshua goes out, fights the military targets, and once everyone, these are called disabling raids by scholars, once the military targets have been disabled, then, of course, Joshua dies. It says he's done everything the Lord has commanded him. Why? Because that's what the Lord commanded him to do. That's what he meant by go up and do these things. And that's why I could say that Joshua's done. Even though it sounds like it's talking about extermination, you would describe those disabling raids as extermination using the literary devices of the time. How would you know? How would we know that it doesn't actually refer to complete annihilation? Again, very first chapter of the next book, which says Joshua's dead, now how are we going to deal with the Canaanites? They would still have to deal with the normal Canaanite towns, not the military targets. Now, Shabir says that all this proves is that these books are contradicting each other. We're not talking about the books contradicting one another. We're talking about these passages being used side by side. One, it'll say, completely wipe them out, there's nothing left. And then in the same chapter, or elsewhere in the same book, it will say, oh yeah, and they're still there. or God's going to drive them out even though they've been completely wiped out. Let me give you an example. In the book of Judges, right, first chapter. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem and also took it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. So, no more Jerusalem, no more people in Jerusalem, right? Verse 21 of the same chapter. The Benjaminites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjaminites. So they took the city, wiped it all out. There's no one there. They burned it to the ground. Later, same chapter. But the Jebusites live there with them to this day. Can this be saying that they annihilated everyone? It can't be saying that. And if we go to the ancient texts of the Near East, we see this over and over and over again like a beating drum. Everyone does this. Now, that's about everything I detected as far as Shabir's response. So let me kind of put this together as far as differences in how we're interpreting these texts. So what are the differences between how I'm interpreting these texts, how Shabir's interpreting these texts, violence in the Bible, violence in the Quran, and so on? One, violence in the Bible would be limited geographically. Keep in mind, you're talking about a little tiny piece of land here. In Islam, it's a much greater area of fighting, and it's ongoing. And that's another difference. Violence in the Bible is limited temporally. Our final marching orders are, love everyone, pray for those who persecute you, live in peace with everyone. You can't get fighting out of that unless you're obviously distorting it. Final marching orders. You can say there's violence. As we saw this, the Quran and the Bible both affirm the Old Testament. So we both have to deal with this, but the final marching orders of the Bible, what's the takeaway message? Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, honor everyone, live in peace with everyone, pursue peace with all men. What are the final marching orders of the Quran? Fight those who do not believe. Those who are with Muhammad are severe against disbelievers, merciful among themselves. Very different takeaway message. And so the final difference here would be you can correct a Christian who decides to commit violence in the name of Jesus Christ, right? If someone says, hey, I was reading that story about Joshua, and I decided I'm going to go kill me some Canaanites. You can sit down and read the Bible beginning to end and accurately show him there are different covenants, and the covenant you are under, the blood of Jesus Christ, that tells you the rules that you are supposed to follow as part of your covenant. There is an earlier covenant, old covenant, new covenant. There is a new covenant that you are under. It gives you specific commands. You have to follow those commands. The reverse is true of Islam. Yes, you can have tons of peaceful Muslims. Most of the Muslims I've ever met in my life are peaceful. But if someone understands the Quran and decides, 929 is telling me to fight, you cannot accurately correct him because that is what the text is telling him to do.
Shabir, your final rebuttal.
I always carry some books, right? And it's a good thing I still have my microphone on. We ready? Okay. So David says he was using sarcasm, and if that's what you say, then I leave it between you and God. Yesterday this came up, and you didn't reply when I expressed my shock that you had said it. And it seems now that the audience is willing to grant you that you have said this in sarcasm, and that left the opening for you to say that that's what you did, and God knows whatever is true. But let's leave that point. Let's leave that point. He's saying that the passage that I referred to from the Quran, Surah 9, verse 29, which he calls the final marching orders. First of all, what is the end point of that passage? Suppose we take it that this means that Muslims should fight against Jews and Christians. It says until they pay the tax, which is called the jizya in the Quran. So that means if people pay the tax, then they can live with Muslims. And historically, this has happened. Non-Muslims have lived under Muslim rule. Muslims understood this passage to mean this. We fight them until they pay the tax. If they pay the tax, they live and they are protected. They become protected citizens. We are responsible for protecting them. If anybody attacks, they don't have to join the army and fight, but we will fight on their behalf. So it's give and take the tax, and we defend them. But he said that I am distorting the verse, where in fact he's distorting the verse, because the verse says, fight those from among the people of the book who do not do this, 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 and this. So he picks one of the things, and he asks you, do you subscribe to the religion of truth? You say no. So now it looks like Muslims are supposed to fight you according to that verse. But no, the verse is saying, fight those who do not meet any one of these 4 qualifications. That's what it literally says in the Arabic. So if he shows that you Christians meet one of the qualifications or 3 of the qualifications, that means still that verse does not apply to you. We only have to disprove that it applies to you by showing that you do not meet one of the qualifications. And I've shown that. Christians believe in God. That's one of the qualifications. So you believe in God, the verse does not apply to you. It's very simple. That's literally what the text says. Now, it's true that Muslims did not take it so literally, and they applied it to Jews and Christians more generally. But the fact that they have done so does not mean that the Quran says so. And our question in these 2 debates is, what does the Quran say and what does the Bible say? Is the Quran a book of peace? Is the Bible a book of peace? So we want to know what the book itself says, because if Muslims turn out to be violent, we can call them back to the Quran. We can say to the ISIS guys, look, you're not really following the Quran. You said you are, but you're distorting the book. But David really wants to say to the ISIS guys, you guys are right. And he wants to say to the moderate Muslims who think we shouldn't be violent, we shouldn't attack anybody. He wants to say to the moderate Muslims like this, no, you're not really following your book. And I'm saying to the moderate Muslims, you are following the book. Because this passage in particular does not tell you to fight against Jews and Christians generally. What it says now has to now be studied all over again because the way in which it has been presented to us in Muslim history has been itself distorted. Now he says, well, it's funny that Shabir is talking about just war, whereas the just war theory came out of the Bible. Actually, that's not true. Just war theory did not come out of the Bible, although the saints that I mentioned did make reference to Romans 13. But Romans 13 presents a problem for just war theory. Remember how David spoke about the brutality of the Romans and the gladiatorial games? I thought the Hunger Games were violent. But the gladiatorial games, and think about more generally about what he said about the Romans and the way they crushed their enemies, generally. Now, Romans 13 is actually praising the Roman authorities and says that they're carrying the sword to act on behalf of God. Whereas it is the same Romans who, under whose aegis Jesus was crucified. So where's the justice in all of this? Jesus was unjustly crucified. He didn't claim what they said he was claiming, and they crucified him. That passage itself poses a problem for just war theory, but nevertheless, it's a good thing that Christian scholars did come up with just war theory. They didn't come up with just war theory because of the Bible. They came up with just war theory as a reasonable response to the fact that there are going to be wars, and they're asking us Christians, which war can we support? And they're coming up with good reasons, but those reasons are not coming straight out of the Bible. In fact, often in contradiction to the Bible, in contradiction to those passages which denote genocide. David says, this legal system that I'm talking about, if I criticize the Bible, I'm indirectly criticizing the Quran, because the Quran says that God gave the land of Israel to Israel. The passage he quotes for that is Surah 5, verse number 32. Just because God said to them, you must establish justice in the land, that means you own the land. That's a far cry from establish justice in the land to you own the land. But there's another passage in the Quran in the 17th chapter in which God commands the Israelites to live in the land, to dwell in the land. And the word there in Arabic is uskunu. And that word is related to being in tranquility. So live peacefully in the land. In chapter 5 as well, the Quran tells the Israelites to enter into the land in a submissive manner, not going in fighting. So it's the Bible that tells them that you should go in and fight and kill everything that breathes. I think David is misrepresenting the Bible. So let me look at some passages here. Deuteronomy chapter 13. If you hear that people are worshiping another god in any of the lands that God has given the Israelites, what are the Israelites to do? You shall put the inhabitants of that city to the sword, placing the city and all that is in it, even its livestock, under the ban. Having heaped all of its spoils in the middle of its square, you should burn the city with all of its spoils as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. That's men, women, children, everything in the city, everything that breathes. You kill them all, you gather them into the midst of the city and burn them as a burnt offering to God, as the Jews used to offer sacrifices by animals to God. This is like a burnt offering to God. Specific numbers are given. In the book of Numbers, chapter 31, Moses and his team go through the Moabite lands, and then they kill so many that what's left behind are the virgins. How many virgins remain? 32,000 virgins. So if you think of the moms and dads and brothers and sisters who were killed, we don't even know the entire number. So this is not just a literary device. Yes, the writers think themselves to be violent. They think they want to represent their heroes as being violent, and that's what they did. Now we're asking, why did the Quran represent the same heroes? Why did this kind of atrocity about Moses get reproduced in the Quran? Suppose Muhammad was a violent individual and he's composing the Quran. And he wants to be violent himself. Why doesn't he show that the role models of the past were as violent as he wants to be? Why is he showing them to be so peaceful in the Quran, whereas they're known to be violent elsewhere? He is giving a different picture. He's turning the attitude of the believers towards a new direction, towards peace and away from violence. Am I the only one saying that because I don't understand the Bible? Peace and Violence in the New Testament by Michel Desjardins. Michel traces all of the passages in the New Testament, in particular, Peace and Violence and the New Testament. I'm sorry, that's the title of the book, Peace and Violence and the New Testament. So she shows that Jesus is represented two ways. One, very peaceful, one, violent. And she says that finally there's no good resolution for that, but it does make it very uncomfortable for her reading and seeing that this is how Jesus is represented in the two ways. I'm saying the two ways are there, and Christians pick the peaceful way, but there's also a violent strain. Thank you.
Finally, for our debate, we have 5-minute summations from each of our speakers. David?
All right, well, all of this is coming together for a good summation. Shabir pointed out accurately that Jews and Christians do, at the end of Surah 9, verse 29, have the option of paying the jizya, in which case we won't be killed. This is an advantage we have over people who don't have scriptures from God, like the pagans. But this is meant to be a humiliation. As far as Muhammad's comment on jizya, Sahih al-Bukhari, as the introduction of chapter 88, the Prophet said, "My livelihood is under the shade of my spear, and he who disobeys my orders will be humiliated by paying jizya." So jizya is a sign of humiliation. That's why it says, feel themselves subdued. You're supposed to feel like you are a second-class person. By the way, the very next verse, as we saw yesterday, is chapter 9, verse 30 of the Quran, which gives the justification. And the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. This isn't just saying believe, if you believe in God in any sense. This is talking about you have to believe in Allah. You believe what Allah, what the Quran says about Allah. You have to believe in what Islam teaches about the last day. As far as proof of this, chapter 9, verse 30, the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah. The Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. These are the words of their mouths. They imitate the saying of those who disbelieved before. Allah's curse be upon them, however they are turned away. This is the justification for fighting us in the previous verse. Don't go with me. Here's Ibn Kathir on this. He says, fighting Jews and Christians is legislated because they are idolaters and disbelievers. Allah encourages the believers to fight the disbelieving Jews and Christians who uttered this terrible statement and lies against Allah. So that's the justification there. Shabir, now turning to the Bible, he says that Romans 13 is praising Roman authorities and presents a problem for just war theory. So just war theory doesn't arise from the Bible. That's completely false. Romans 13 is written by Paul, where he tells us that rulers are given authority by God to punish wrongdoers and so on, and that we have to submit to them. That in no way conflicts with obligations for rulers. We see this from the Apostle Paul himself in the book of Acts chapter 25, when the Roman governor wants to hand him over. And Paul says, if I've done something worthy of death, I do not hesitate to die. But if I haven't, no one has the right to hand me over to them. He's talking to the Roman governor. I thought, according to Shabir, Paul believed you just, do whatever the government said. What is this? You have just war theory right there. Yes, you, government, you have authority. But you also have obligations to do the right thing. Put those together, that's where you get it. Now, Shabir cites Numbers 31 as the last example. I'm running out of time here, so I don't get to respond to everything. But Numbers 31 is another perfect example. The Midianites are completely wiped out, except for the women who didn't try to lead Israel astray by taking Balaam's offer of seducing the Israelites away and convincing them to worship other gods. Those women were brought into Israel. So there's no more Midianites, right? If we go with a literal interpretation of the text, no hyperbole, no hyperbolic rhetoric or anything, straightforward interpretation, there are no more Midianites. And yet we read, just a little later, here in the book of Judges, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. What Midianites? They're all gone, right? Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. The Israelites are hiding because there's so many Midianites. How could it be any more clear? Every example we're given of complete annihilation and complete extermination, all the groups that are supposedly exterminated are around later, and the passages are used interchangeably with driving them out and things like that. And so you'd have to say that something is going on with the text here, and it obviously is, and scholars know what it is because they have other ancient texts. And so, Shabir says the Quran tells Jews to live in the land peacefully. That doesn't change the fact that in 532 they're told they get to carry out Jewish law, Jewish penalties in that land. And so if this is a problem for the Bible, this would be a problem for the Quran. And so have we seen any reason to think that the Bible is not a book of peace? Again, is there violence in the Old Testament? Is there invasion of the land and so on? Yes, keep in mind what these people were doing. Their practices were child sacrifice and bestiality and so on. And God kept his people in Egypt for 4 centuries because he would not allow them to take the land until they were so incredibly sinful that he would put an end to it. And what did he do then? He had them fight their militaries and drive them out. So even here, in the most violent passages you have, it's certainly not as bad as Shabir makes it out to be. But then when we consider the final marching orders, love your neighbors yourself, pray for those who persecute you, live in peace with everyone, there's no way we can say with a straight face that the Bible is not a book of peace.
Shabir, your final concluding statement.
And my microphone is still turned on. Ready to go, John? Okay, I have to turn it off lest we lose battery here. Okay, so finally, folks, I'm glad that we've come down to put our final thoughts together on what has transpired over the last 2 nights. I started out by giving common criteria by which to evaluate the 2 books. And to my estimation, David has not given common criteria. He has attacked the Quran from one angle, and he has supported the Bible from a different angle. So we need common criteria. You cannot attack the Quran for something that is there in the Bible, or even worse, in the Bible. We have genocide in the Bible. It's not there in the Quran. He says it's not really genocide. It's just a literary device. But in fact, the passages are very clear. Well, I've read to you a passage or one or more passages from the Bible which show that God is really clearly commanding this genocide. Now, did God actually command those genocide? I don't believe so. Does the Quran say that God commanded that genocide? No way. So the Quran is not contradicting itself. When the Quran is saying that the Jews had the right to practice the revelations from God and the instructions that came from him to enact justice on the land, so that does not contradict, God does not contradict himself by doing so. He's telling them to do the right thing. If later on their books are composed and then they do something that is wrong in the land, then this is their distortion of the message from God, and the Quran is not responsible for that. As for the Midianites, it's very clear. So many are killed and the rest are saved. We know the number of those who are saved. It's not a literary device. Clearly that there is some problem there. There is genocide, large amounts of people being killed. So when we look at the Quran, then, we see that I have delineated my classifications and my conditions for determining whether a book is a book of peace or not. And I've said the first thing is, how do you represent your heroes? And we have seen that many heroes of the Bible are misrepresented, I would say, as people who enacted genocide and ethnic cleansing. The Quran actually gives a different picture of those heroes and presents them as pictures of peace. Second, is there a passage which actually commands us to enter into peace? And David has cited Hebrews, and I agree, many passages of the Bible teach us to live in peace. The Quran as well, I said, Surah 2, verse number 208, tells Muslims to enter into peace categorically. David disputed my translation of that passage. He said he's not familiar with any of the ancient commentaries that say that, but I've actually cited two. I've cited Az-Zajjaj, who said this, and I've cited Al-Qurtubi, who said that it literally means that, but we can't accept that. Basically, that's what he said, in essence. So that's what I've been saying all along. Muslim commentators have not accepted the message of the Quran, pure and simple as it was. They have turned the Quran into a violent book through their misinterpretations. Even though they were good and great scholars, but they were subject to their time and place and environment, just like I'm subject to my time and place and environment. What leads me to go back and research all of these things? Because of my time and place and environment, and certain circumstances and research material that is available to me now. I have a stick here which I've just plugged into my computer, giving me access to 12,500 ancient Arabic books. So we have tools, we have different circumstances and so on, so we can go back and re-examine certain things. So the Quran does actually command people to live in peace. The third thing, does it have a legal system? I think the Bible really fails on this point, because especially the New Testament, David said the legal system is left to others, because Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. So this world is left to somebody else to run according to their own devices, the Romans especially, with the gladiatorial games. That's going to be justice in the land. And then the last point I said is that does it have a legal system, and does the just war theory. I said that everything in the Quran falls within just war theory. Even when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, went into war, he went as a legitimate authority. This is where ISIS and others fail. This is where the young man living in this great city takes it upon himself. He's not a legitimate authority. He cannot think we Muslims are at war with America and I'm going to go attack some installation or some Marines or something like that. He's just not a legitimate and proper authority. He fails on the first point. Whereas it is clear in the Quran that Muslims are to obey their authorities. Wa ulil amri minkum, the Quran says. And we have to obey whatever authorities are above us. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, only went to war when he was a legitimate authority and when he had the responsibility to protect his citizens and to protect the oppressed people. So he was following actually just war theory. Whereas, in fact, when we look at the Bible, we see that this does not fall into just war theory, because we have genocide and ethnic cleansing, not on one occasion, but on several occasions. Maybe this did not happen historically. It's not really true. But the Bible is celebrating it as though it is true, and therefore the Bible fails on this point. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum again. Peace upon you. We know that those great two debaters are going to go back tomorrow in their planes and to their country. But in this case, to the Bronx. It's another country anyway. Yeah.
Another country.
It's not the same. So basically, we are left alone, but we are going to be one. We're not going to be two. We are Americans. Thank you and good night. We're going to do the questions right now.
Yeah, thank you, Shabir and David, for a fascinating debate, a very well-informed, respectful, and intelligent discussion. We do want to give you the opportunity now to ask some questions of these learned scholars. We'd ask if you would line up on either one of these hallways, and we'll try to alternate questions, one to another, one to David, one to Shabir, and give you a chance to ask these scholars questions. We'd ask you not to give a speech or a long commentary, but try to direct your questions to whoever you would like, and we'll try to get some answers from both of our speakers, a brief 2-minute response and then a 1-minute rebuttal. Let's start here.
What is your question?
David, my question is for you. Basically, on your point about the New Testament, the final marching orders being for peace, I was going to ask, would you also say the same thing about the Old Testament, or just more properly the Hebrew Bible? Because after you mentioned the limited geography for the wars, wouldn't it also be limited time? And it was initially an offensive war to capture or to get Israel, but then after that, the final marching orders are only defensive wars that's commanded to Israel.
Yeah, you have, and Shabir actually pointed some of this out, that there was a distinction in the Old Testament between the sort of initial orders for taking the land and for a few enemies in particular, but this was different from from the orders for fighting other people. But yes, I mean, at the end of the day, what you have is that Israel was told, you're going to take this land. Here are the reasons you are to take this land. It's not because of your righteousness, it's because of their wickedness. And God even tells them that he will treat them in the same way. He says, I will treat you in the same way as the Canaanites. Did this battery run out? Check. Okay. He says he will treat them in the same way. He says that the land will vomit them out. So the same thing that happened to the Canaanites, that they would be driven out, would happen to the Israelites if it happened to them as well. And you see this happen later when they rebel. They go off into captivity. So the same thing happens. But also you have there, when Jesus says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, he's actually quoting Leviticus there. And in the same chapter of Leviticus, they're told, and by the way, you have to treat the stranger in the same way. That the stranger that is among you, you're to make no difference between you, because you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so, they have the land, and they have to maintain the land, and they can make war if there's meant to be war, something like that. But at the end of the day, it's a limited land. I mean, it's limited geographically, and we're talking about the Bible, so we're assuming that the Bible is one complete text, and many Jews wouldn't regard it like that. But if you're taking the New Testament as the final marching orders, that's what I'm talking to, because I don't want to speak for Jews on how they would interpret the final marching orders of the Old Testament.
The same one I'm using now?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. The New Testament represents Jesus as being the Davidic Messiah. If he was truly the Davidic Messiah, then he had to sit on the throne and rule instead of David. And that means he had to violently overthrow Roman rule. Why didn't Christians represent Jesus as doing exactly this? Well, some passages do, and some passages have him turning away from that. So the last of the four Gospels have the most evolved version of this story, where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. So he's disowning it. Why are Christians disowning the kingdom of this world? Because it would have been dangerous for them to confront the Romans and say that our Messiah, the man we think to be king, was the one who was crucified on the cross. So Christians represented themselves as being peaceful. They wrote the New Testament as though Jesus was peaceful, but violent strains remain in the New Testament, and we can see it in the book of Revelation, also in Luke, where Jesus says that when he comes back, he will be like the king who says, bring my enemies and slay them here before me.
Is there a question to Shabir?
This is the second time I heard this just war theory, and it's from this book here of George Bush. And it said St. Augustine in his classic, The City of Gods, and we as a country, and I'm a Catholic, but we as a Vietnam veteran, but we went to war on the just war theory. And I like the gentleman here who's been an atheist, now he's a Christian. Can you give me some clarity to that?
Well, I mean, just war theory is a set of principles because you can have war and it can be unjust. And then the idea is that you can have a just war, because there are some people who would say war is never just. So the idea behind a just war theory is there are just wars, right? Like I would consider fighting Hitler, I would consider that a just war. It doesn't mean that, but even in the context of a just war, you have to operate by those principles, because if you're going over there and you're fighting Hitler, but then you get a bunch of old ladies and torture them or something like that, you're not operating within the just war theory. So it's just a set of principles. But any particular war, you're going to have to go through what happened in the war and look. Does what happened? Did the orders? Did what was commanded and what actually happened? Does that line up with the principles of just war? And if the answer is no, then according to theory, it would not be a just war.
Read this book of George Bush, The Christian Life of George Bush. They went to war with just war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question is relevant to our present times, because everyone claims that what they're fighting is a just war. And some Christians believe that the war on Iraq is not a just war, because, first of all, it's mingled with the idea of spreading our ideology of freedom and democracy abroad and the war for spreading your idea in a modern time, this does not fit within the just war theory. It fitted somehow with the life of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, because at that time, the only way of unifying the community and establishing peace on the land was through an ideology. But nowadays, of course, we've learned through democracy to live with each other despite varying ideologies. And so to bring that into the picture today, into a war, it does not fit within just war theory. Moreover, if we think about just cause, the idea of going into Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction, but no such weapons have been found, and the evidence for that is now thought to have been once concocted. Thank you.
Over the last night and tonight, we've heard so many points, a lot of information. The average man or woman, probably cannot, understand most of it. And I heard some different interpretations. I heard that Dr. Wood said the Quran was clear, and tonight he said that the Bible needs to interpret this way or that way. And it was a question yesterday, how do you explain that all this violence in the Middle East or in Muslim countries if they are following the Quran? And obviously the Muslim countries don't have veto power but also I want somebody to explain to me how would the Muslims would rule Spain for 800 years, ruling, mainly Christians, and then they don't wipe them out, they don't kill them all, whether they and don't even attempt to convert them. Yet when the Muslims lose power, everybody knows about the Inquisition and so forth. So all we can get out of this is what the books, or what effect those books have on the people of the faith. So
thank you.
Explain that.
You want to respond?
Sure. David has given, as the questioner is pointing out, a rosy picture of how Christians have been positively influenced by the Bible, and that's great. We admit that. But at the same time, as the questioner points out, like the Crusaders, the way they behaved, that was not very biblical, was it? And I have a whole book here written entitled "The Bible Tells Me So: Uses and Abuses of Holy Scripture," and by Jim Hill and another author. The book just simply shows that people can use the Bible in one way or misuse it in another way, and people have done that over history. There have been killings, there have been inquisitions, witch hunts, wars of religion in Europe, Protestants fighting Catholics, and so on. To this day, some violence continues by people who think that they're acting on the Bible. Whereas, on the other hand, as the questioner points out, the other side of the picture that we should bear in mind about Muslim history is that even though I have come down hard on the classical commentators on the Quran, but they said many good things which Muslims have benefited from. In fact, when non-Muslim historians of religion think about just war theory, they say that Muslim scholars themselves constructed their own just war theory, and they point out to many positive aspects of that theory. If you read, for example, a book by John Kelsey and another two books co-authored by him and Turner, they point to how just war theory has been thought about by both Muslims and Christians and by others throughout history. So it is not something exclusive to Christianity that Christianity can produce good people. In fact, what Professor Darrell Cole has pointed out is that during the Crusader years, Saladin, who was a Muslim champion at the time, when he was in a position of power, he treated his enemies in a much better way, in fact with forgiveness and mercy, as opposed to the treatment given by the European invaders at the time.
Yeah, I'm gonna disagree with some of the historical claims, but as far as what we're arguing about, that's not even what I'm concerned with. If every Muslim in the world was completely peaceful, or every Muslim in the world was violent, or every Christian in the world was peaceful, or every Christian in the world was violent, we're talking about what the texts say, right? We're talking about what the texts say. And so, of course, anyone can abuse any text, regardless of how peaceful it is or regardless of how violent it is. But these two debates are about what the texts say. And in Islam, it's right there from the beginning. Muhammad fights, Abu Bakr fights, Umar fights, Uthman fights, Ali fights. The fighting is built into it. In Christianity, The disciples aren't fighting. The next generation's not fighting. The following generation's not fighting. No one's fighting until the 4th century, when the Roman emperor gets a vision that he can conquer through the cross. And so in Christianity, the violence is something that has to be added to it from outside by an empire absorbing it and using it for violent ends. And they're two completely different situations.
My question to Mr. David. You mentioned that with the new covenant and there is a new marching order for peace. So my question is that why, if there is a new marching order for peace, then in Matthew 10:13 it says that when you enter a village and you find a house worthy, you give peace to them, but I'm kind of paraphrasing. And if it is not worthy, take your peace away. And does that kind of, was that rule which Peter used to carry the sword with him when he attacked the Malchus? If it was all peaceful, Jesus, why Peter was carrying the sword with which he attacked? Was he using the sword to cut salad? Or was he following the Luke 22 where it was commanded them to go and buy the sword, not one sword, but two swords?
All right, so there are two issues there. One of taking your blessing of peace away. So yes, Jesus did say that, and this isn't talking about fighting or killing anyone. It's talking about I give you my blessing, and if you reject, if you are rejecting the Messiah, okay, well I'm taking it away. I'm going elsewhere. But notice you're leaving, and it's I'm going to hack you all up and subjugate you. As far as Peter taking the sword, Jesus explains why he's telling them to get the sword. He says, because the scripture must be fulfilled, that he will be numbered among the transgressors. So, and notice, they say, we have two swords, and he says, that's enough. Now, that's enough for what? For a violent rebellion against the Roman Empire? Of course that's not enough for a violent revolution against the Roman Empire. So it must mean something other than this is enough swords for violent revolution. What is it? It's enough to fulfill the prophecy, namely that he's going to be numbered among transgressors. That's what he says. He gives that as the reason. And so what happens? The Romans show up. Peter has a sword. These are transgressors. This is a violent uprising and so on. But notice this, the moment Peter uses it, Jesus rebukes him, tells him not to do it, and that's the last violence for 4 centuries in Christianity, and it was condemned by Jesus himself. So if you're trying to read into that, you see Christians are really violent, and they want a violent revolution because Peter had a sword that was supposedly in fulfillment of a prophecy, and then Jesus rebuked him for using it and told him not to do it, that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. I'd say that's a pretty flimsy basis for saying that the Bible is a book of violence.
Romans were outnumbered.
Okay. So, as I pointed out last night, in the Quran, Jesus appears to be entirely peaceful, and I believe that Jesus was a peaceful individual. However, in the New Testament, there are two layers. There is an undercurrent that represents Jesus as being violent, and there is an overlay that represents him as being peaceful. Now, how do scholars put this together? Some scholars think he was truly violent, like Reza Aslan, for example, in his recent book entitled Zealot. He paints Jesus as a violent revolutionary. Some others think that he wasn't necessarily violent, and he could have been a non-violent revolutionary. So how do we see these two layers going? So if Jesus was violent, how does he come now to be represented in the upper layer as being peaceful? That is because, as the questioner is pointing out, the Christians were outnumbered. They were under Roman rule. They dare not say that we are a challenge to the Roman Empire. And the fact that Jesus was crucified under the charge of being king of the Jews, historians think means that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews, or at least the Romans thought that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews, which means not the Romans, but he is king. And that's a challenge to the Roman Empire. This is how they deal with an insurrectionist. So he died as an insurrectionist. That's the undercurrent. The overlay is that Christians represented to be peaceful because they couldn't have done anything different.
It's a question for David, and then I would like Shabir to elaborate after that. You talk about just text, and you just talk about text, and you used ISIS and Qaeda and everything. So my question to you, why did you not bring forward one practical evidence to prove when Muslims are majority are different when they are not? And then you also failed to talk about the recent history war war like World War I and II, and you failed to talk about the dictatorship in Egypt, in Syria, and how the Western country are supporting them by our tax money. And you also failed to talk about Algeria, about French Empire and British Empire, the occupation in Algeria and Tunisia and Egypt, and how they murdered and massacred that took place under Christianity. And nowadays, Central Africa, Muslims have been murdered every day, burned alive. No one even talk about it. And this is, it's a practical, I would like to hear you when you, not to talk theoretical, but practical. This is a question for both of you. Thank you.
So I guess the claim is why in my debate on whether the Quran is a book of peace and in my debate on whether the Bible is a book of peace, I didn't talk about World War I and World War II and all these different nations because they're completely irrelevant to the topic. As I just said, if every Christian in the world becomes violent or every Christian in the world becomes entirely peaceful, or with Muslims as well, that doesn't change the text. These religions were defined a long time ago, centuries ago. And he says, well, you pointed out ISIS. I only mentioned ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on in the opening statement just to show that that Shabir and I and others are not reading the Quran in the same way. And it was to raise the question, who's right? Now, you could raise the same question. You could say, look, Christians have done different things down through the ages, so who's right, who's correct? But that would just be a question to introduce the topic, and that's all I used it as. So as far as ISIS killing people and so on, and and Western Muslims being being peaceful for the most part, that wouldn't matter as far as the topic goes, right? The Quran has been around for a long, long time, and so the question, is it a book of peace, is based on the text and the correct interpretation of the text. So notice that the only sort of historical information that would be relevant is how it was interpreted by the earliest generations, because those are the people with the least outside influence, right? As time goes by, as centuries go by, both books are subject to more and more outside influence, and so the earliest historical evidence would be relevant to the interpretations of the early generations. But beyond that, I mean, it's just the texts and then how it's interpreted by the early followers.
Dealing with the text, I've already shown how David had misconstrued Surah 9, verse number 29, which he referred to as the final marching orders. In fact, he takes the entire surah that way. Last night as well, he mentioned Surah 9, verse number 5. But what he misses is that the verse just before that, verse number 4, shows that there are exceptions. It says, except those people with whom you have a covenant. And then the verse after that actually speaks about people who are from the other side who come to you seeking refugee status. The Quran says, then فَأَجِرْهُ, grant him refugee status. ثُمَّ أَبْلِغْهُ مَأْمَنًا, and then in the end, transport him to a place where he will be safe. So the Quran is showing that it's not a generalized command. If you take the one verse out of its context, Surah 9, verse number 5, it looks like Muslims are being commanded to kill others. But no, it's a very specific command, and with exceptions and stipulations and so on. It's about the people who had actually broken the covenant. And who are being commanded? As I said, Fred Donner said that it's not the Muslims alone, but Muslims together with Jewish and Christian believers. And I've seen that same thing is playing out in Surah 9, verse number 29.
Yeah. This question is for David. And I read some of the Bible, and I want to say the Bible gave me some horror and nightmare in one topic only. And I wouldn't say I'm excellent in math, but I flunked my math because of the Bible. And I came to that when it says a Trinity. Trinity, one is all three, and three are one, and this and that. And what I couldn't understand is if the son of Maryam is all three, or the other way, one is the three, and the three is... And when the son of Maryam was put in the grave, what happened to the other two? Were they buried with the son of Maryam? Yeah. I'm talking about Trinity. how one can be all three and three are one. And if the one is a three and the three are one and put in the grave, who was in the grave? The son of Maryam only or the other two?
I think this question is out of topic. So
I know, but it's giving me a nightmare.
It's not a place for
Yeah,
it.
well, he's obviously traumatized, and,
Yes,
and
yes.
fortunately he was able to
flunked
pull
man.
himself out and come out here and make this statement for us and get away from his nightmares. But yeah, I had a great.
We are talking about the horror of the Bible, and this is a horror.
Let me put it this way: since they were talking about future debates, if Shabir would like to come here and debate the concept of God or something like that, I'd be happy to. But in case people have actual questions that are related to the topic, be interested in those.
We have time for a couple more questions. So.
Okay. I do believe that the Bible shows us how we can have true peace, not just in society, but in our hearts. But the Bible also does say that Christ will come to judge the world, and he also says that there is no peace for the wicked. So I was just wondering, I'd like to hear how you bring those two concepts together.
Who, me? Okay. Yeah, well, it's true. There are different kinds of peace, and when we talk about whether the Bible is a book of peace, I'm assuming we were talking about peace with others, and not not an internal sense of peace. As far as, what was the other part?
How do you bring together the concept of there is no peace for the wicked and Christ coming to judge the world?
Oh, yeah.
And the Bible being a book of peace.
Well, it's actually, because I read that, and I'm reading that entirely differently. He's saying it's not a book of peace because Jesus is going to come and judge, when according to Islam, Jesus is going to come and judge as well. So, but as far as the Bible being a book of peace, saying, well, Jesus is eventually going to come and judge, when you're told that you are not to pass judgment because God is going to judge and Jesus is going to come and put everything right. If you're an atheist or something else and you don't believe that, you should regard that as the most wonderful teaching ever. Lovely. These Christians are told they don't get to carry out God's judgment. They have to wait until Jesus returns, which from an atheist perspective is never going to happen, and therefore these Christians are never allowed to carry out God's judgment in this world. So if you want to say, yes, Jesus is going to judge, and there's going to be judgment, and it's not going to be pretty. But as far as the Bible being a book of peace, I'm assuming we're talking about how we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to interact with others, and that a future judgment, and you as a Christian not being allowed to carry out God's judgments against unbelievers here in the world. What could be more peaceful than that? As far as hey, you don't get to touch anyone until Jesus returns. And again, it's the reverse in Islam, that Muslims get to carry out God's judgment in certain contexts, not in every context, not here in the West and so on, but in certain contexts, absolutely.
So if Christians are not allowed to touch anyone, evil or whatever they are, and whatever they do, then that means the secular authorities have to bring the law into vogue here and deal with the evil one. So Romans 13 is talking about the Romans doing this. Then we have to have some other authority, secular or otherwise, instituting peace on behalf of Christians, and Christians have to turn a blind eye to whatever is happening. So that brings me back to the point that the New Testament does not give you a legal system by which to establish peace on the land. Now you can say, okay, I'll turn the other cheek, but that's if somebody harms you. But what if somebody's harming somebody else? Do you have the responsibility to protect if you have the power? So this is where just war theory comes in, and it actually owes itself to much more than just the Bible, and the New Testament does not actually give us the basis for formulating a complete just war theory and a legal system with which to enact peace on the land. In fact, the undercurrent again is that the New Testament Christians were following the Old Testament laws. So yes, if some Amalekite did raise his head, that Amalekite would have to be killed according to God's commandments. That's one of the commandments, and the early Christians were following the commandments. They were reading the Old Testament. That was their Bible before the New Testament was written.
We just have time for one more question.
All right, my question is for Dr. Shabir. In your introduction, you stated that God the Father will make his Son, Jesus, his enemies, Jesus' footstools. According to the Christian belief, everyone who doesn't follow and believe in God are, in essence, enemies. If the Christian view of God is correct, in keeping with the objectivity of this debate, then wouldn't it be just and right for God to do away with those who didn't give themselves to him while he gave them time to, and when he returns to make everything new, or his second coming and all that follows?
Well, it brings us to think about how much responsibility God has. You know, if I dig a hole, then I have the responsibility to barricade it and put warning signs so nobody falls into the hole, right? So God has created hell. If people are falling into hell in large numbers, then God has some responsibility as well. I mean, that's fair. We know that, and we know that God is fair. The Quran describes him as ahkamul hakimin, the best of judges. So from the Muslim conception, God gives people leeway and excuses, even though people might appear to us to be very wicked, but it's possible that God may forgive some of the people of whom we have no expectation that God will forgive them. And sometimes we feel ourselves righteous. We think, why should God forgive him? I'm trying to be righteous. But think about the story of the prodigal son. The one son stayed with his father, obeying and doing everything right. The other son was prodigal. He went away and he came back. When he came back, he was welcomed with open arms. The father loved him and welcomed him, and nobody had to pay the price for his wickedness. The Father just simply forgave him. Something like this is the Islamic concept. Now, there are people who are wicked, people who do not know God, people who disobey God, and so on. So we leave the judgment up to God. But would God deal with these people like in a violent way in this world? Well, the New Testament presents Jesus as the Davidic Messiah who should sit on the throne and rule, but he didn't rule. Instead, he was hanging on a cross. So what Christians did was they tried to re-envision who Jesus was, and they represented him as a peaceful individual, but there was the undercurrent thinking that he must come back and rule like that, and hence we have the book of Revelation. When we know that, we can go back and see that there are little hints here and there. For example, in the beginning of Luke's Gospel, it says that the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that what will be born of you, this is the son of David, he will be the Messiah, he will be the Davidic Messiah. Now, in the Muslim conception, Jesus is not violent. He's not represented as the Davidic Messiah, which means there's no violence to be credited to him. And the Quran only vaguely refers to his return, if at all, and doesn't say that he will be violent when he returns.
Well, that was a brutal attack on the Quran. Remember, Shabir quoted a verse earlier from Surah 57, which says that Allah filled Christians with compassion and mercy. And now he's saying we just did it to cover up the fact that our Messiah had failed, and now we have to, sort of get along with the Romans or we'll be killed. So, I mean, if that's the reason that Christians became compassionate and peaceful, then it's not Allah who filled us, and so the Quran would be wrong. But the Psalm 110 is actually, that is a great summary with God making Jesus' enemies a footstool for his feet, because we've been seeing that around the world. We saw it happen with the Roman Empire, but then we saw it carried on into the modern world, and we see people around the world being influenced by Jesus' teachings. And since war was brought up during World War II, a U.S. soldier found himself on an island in the Pacific, and he saw that missionaries had been there, and one of the natives was carrying around a Bible, and the soldier said, "Us educated people don't believe in that anymore." And the native said, "You better be glad we do, or we'd be eating you right now." And,
on that happy note, well, thank you all very much for being as part of this.
Just one thing. That's how we want you to be. That's how we want you to be. And one more thing. We will know.
Okay.
Thank you. If we want to know about each other's religion, I want you to invite me to every church you have, and I want you to come on Fridays and let me know, call me, to come and be in our prayer room and see and learn about us. Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Thank you.